Tim Williams' background story. What exactly is the Director of Business Development?
Title that I made up.
Is that a title you made up?
No, it's basically, at Flaherty Insurance, I was, brought in to figure out, one, grow their business.
Yeah.
Figure out, what's there. And so that's partly production in there, bringing in, acquiring new customers, also looking at acquiring some talent, but also ways that we can improve our efficiency inside the insurance agency. So, whether that be bringing in new vendors or looking at new InsurTech products and how that may speed up our enhancement of who we have in there and how our workflows are done. So it's kind of we created the position inside of there and to fill a need.
Jack of all trades.
Yep, for sure.
So tell us about Flaherty Insurance.
Flaherty Insurance has been around probably 30, 40 years. Dan Flaherty is the owner. He's out of Hanover. His dad had started the agency, and Dan had taken it over when his dad had passed, and in the 80s, in that range. So it's a family business, smaller type agency. We have 7 employees, but we Dan came from a background of underwriting at an insurance company from a different perspective, and we both have different talents, and we have a pool of people inside of there to help us.
Yeah. So how long have you been there?
I've been there a little over 2 years. Okay. Prior to that, I was with another insurance agency that was a larger insurance agency that had eight agencies around the Massachusetts, and I didn't like my role there was limited because you're at a bigger agency, you're pretty much specialized into one product and not being able to handle your customers as much, which is something I didn't want. I want to be able to do more for my clients and be able to interact with them and be able to offer them what I want to do.
So what's your background? Are you from the area originally, or?
Yeah, I'm a lifelong Marshfield resident. I've been here the entire 47 years of my life. I've lived in all sorts of parts of town, from right here near the high school down to Marshfield Hills, and now I'm currently over in Fieldston.
Okay. So. I was always curious if you were a lifelong Marshfield resident.
I am. It's a great town. So I wanted to come back.
So what's a normal day for you? What's the typical work day like?
My work day usually starts out. It will work. I'd say 70% of the time I'm working with personal clients, meaning they're not commercial. They're homeowners that have auto insurance or home insurance or flood insurance needs, and reviewing their policies, seeing what needs they have, talking with the carriers, trying to figure out what the best fit is. Not every client's exactly the same, and going through there. And then some of the times I'm working on businesses, so I'll be reviewing a client's policy that they have up for renewal, talking to the carriers, talking to the underwriters, trying to understand if their products fit and how they're going to rate something. So,
what's probably the percentage of like business to personal?
That ranges from every insurance agency. Personally for me. Mine's probably more like a 70-30 split, really? 70% personal, 30% commercial. Dan's probably more on the 50-50 side. But I'd say it's about 70-30 is where we come in on that.
Something I've noticed is, I'd say probably, I don't know, you can agree with me, disagree with me. It seems like maybe over the past several years, there's been more interaction with the insurance broker and the customer instead of just the once a year, oh, here's your renewal sort of thing, or you're calling your insurance guy when you have a problem. It seems like there's been more relationship building in that industry.
It's interesting background, and you bring that up. I think there's several different ways people approach it. It's the private equity markets kind of got into the insurance industry because they looked at give me an industry that's poor in customer service, that's got bad technology. And they started looking around and they said insurance, and it's true, and if you think back, 20 years ago, or even when I first got my auto policy, nobody called me and explained to me what my coverages were. And I still think that goes on today a little bit,
Right.
with the Geicos and the Progressives. And
The big guys.
yeah, because everything's kind of commodity driven and it's price driven. So they're always save, save, save. We can save you 40, 20, 15% in 15 minutes. It's all about speed, but no one is ever telling you about, well, you're not covered if you do it, you're looking at this coverage, or here's why you might want this coverage increased.
Or you're
So-
going to walk through hell to get an answer.
Right. So, the industry has really changed on that level. And there has been a lot of technology improvements to it. So it makes our job easier because we can do things faster. We can look at things, get rates, we can get claims, we can get, losses history faster. And it's changing the industry. So it's a roundabout way,
Yeah.
it's there. It's also, I think, an industry where you're losing a lot of agencies. There's a lot of acquisitions. There's a lot of clients that are being bought by bigger firms, and it's not an industry a lot of young people are going into.
Something I know you've been super involved in is flood insurance.
Correct.
I know you, and we're going to talk maybe a little bit more about some of the work that you do. So take us through flood insurance right now. What's going on? I mean, a lot of people in Marshfield are going to be listening to this. A lot of them live on the coast or
Yep,
are impacted.
Yeah. So flood insurance I think when I first got into it, it wasn't something people thought about. It was kind of a hindsight thing. Mortgage companies weren't even really telling you needed it. And if they did, you were getting a letter a year or two later after you bought the house. Hey, by the way, you need flood insurance. And then they started getting fines because of the programs that were involved in it. And now that the premiums are larger and the increases are larger, I think everyone's aware about if they're in a flood zone, what they're paying, and all of this. And we've seen the losses too. So it's not an issue that's going to go away. And it's complex. People don't understand the program through the NFIP. And then the private market has came onto the scene and started getting competitive in areas, and it's not easy for the consumer to understand. And it's not something a normal agency is doing day in and day out,
Right.
so there's a lot of misconception.
I want to get back to private market and FIP for a second, but
Yep.
I know, especially in Marshfield, where we are, you're probably people calling you saying, "I was told I need flood insurance," and it happened
Right.
in my case. I live in the center of town.
Sure.
And when I bought my house,
Sure.
10 years ago, they told me, "Oh, you need flood insurance."
Right.
Are you having those conversations with people saying like, "Yeah, you do," according to educating them on flood maps and
Yeah, so the flood maps are basically a determination from mortgage companies to see if you need lender required flood insurance.
Because I think when people think flood insurance, they're like, "I don't live by the water."
Right. So that's one of the misconceptions is a lot of the claims out there are from, it's almost 40 to 60% of the claims are outside of the flood hazard zone. So when I talk about whether you're in a flood zone or not, everybody's in a flood zone, but there's a special flood hazard area. That's a higher risk area. So that's something that people got to get a grasp on. So when you're talking about a 100-year storm, which I can't stand that terminology because everyone's like, "Oh, it's a 100-year storm."
Yeah.
Well, I've never flooded, and I'm like, well, your risk of having a house fire is 6% of a 30-year mortgage.
Okay.
A flood, 26%.
Really?
Huge numbers, big difference. That's why home insurance doesn't cover it. They know it's going to be there. So when we talk about flooding, it's not just your typical flooding that people in the coastline are going to have, but we're seeing these storms now with 8-inch rain, 10 inches of rain, 30 inches of rain, and the development can't handle that. Stormwaters, drains, they can't handle that type of intensity over that short period of time. So you look at Harvey, which had 100 inches of rain come through the entire state of Texas or, Houston area. Most of those people were not covered.
Right. You mentioned one of the things going on is the NFIP and the private market. Just talk about that.
Yeah. So, I think Lloyd's of London has a syndicate, and there are very different people who go to them to get their put together their private insurance.
Right.
And they have different models in the NFIP. The NFIP is, kind of the rules are set up by Congress and how they.
So that's a
dictate
federally.
It's a federally backed program,
Okay.
so they can't react as quickly. So the private markets come in and they said, you know what, we see that FEMA's done a good job with mapping in here, but some of these areas we feel there's not as great a risk as they think. In a certain area in this flood zone, we're willing to write that flood insurance, and we can do it at a lower premium. So they'll come in certain cases, and they'll look at an area and say, oh, we can offer you 40% less than what the NFIP is doing for this particular home, because they're using things like LiDAR technology, and they're seeing ground elevations, and they can determine how high a house is versus what a normal map might not. You might
Right.
not be able to see that this house is elevated versus another house. So that's where the private market has stepped up and come in there. Now there are some pitfalls to the private market, obviously, because if we have a superstorm Sandy come up through Massachusetts and decides to wipe out Plymouth County, they could decide to leave and say it's not profitable anymore. We're out, and then you're going to have to go find flood insurance, where the NFIP cannot leave. Right. So, there's pluses and minuses to both.
I was gonna say. So you're involved with the Mass Coastal Coalition.
Yep.
Tell us about that.
So it kind of started out of here locally in Marshfield, because the residents were during Bigot Waters, which was an act through Congress, that we're trying to raise flood insurance rates and do some things. There wasn't really an advocate for residents, to have a voice or understand what their policies or things are doing. So it started in Marshfield, and then as we as a board who kind of started doing projects, we started having other communities approach us, and they all have the same exact problems. How do we get the town to listen to us on a certain subject? How can we help the town develop a program? What do we do about mitigation? What type of grants are available? So all of these issues, what can we do after a storm? What can we do before a storm? So these are the things that we try and tackle at the Massachusetts Coastal Coalition. So there's an element of it that's it's definitely for the stakeholders. We have political aspects where we're trying to lobby, and we have things that we're trying to help consumers out on and understand their policies, and that's kind of what it's grown into, and it's continuing to grow.
Now, aren't you involved also with the town in regards to some of this coastal?
Yeah, so the town has through the NFIP and FEMA, they've developed a program called the CRS, which is a community rating system. So CRS is it's a floodplain management tool. So what they try and do is they say, all right, here's our 1,200-page manual for every town to go through. I joke, but it's pretty large.
No, I believe it.
If you take these certain steps, we're going to give you points for every type of thing in there. So in the CRS manual will be the things for mapping and elevation certificates, or Marshfield's got quite a bit of open space. So if you keep that as open space, they give you so many points for that. The higher amount of points in CRS, the steeper the discount would be for NFIP flood insurance policyholders. So there was a time Marshfield had a 20% discount, and then it had fallen off, and they were out of the program. We came back into the program in Marshfield, and it's at 5% now. And we've been doing a ton of work for our 5-year audit, which is coming up in 2 weeks, to get us to the level of 15% discount, which we, knock on wood, hopefully we'll have. So we calculated that out, and roughly there's about 2,500 flood insurance policyholders in Marshfield. We'd be saving them $300,000 total, just by getting going from a 5% to a 15% discount. And it's helping the town get some floodplain management, things in there to be a little bit more resilient. So
It feels like all this is a full-time job, basically.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. It can be a full-time job, and you kind of have to take your time and figure out when you can.
But does it kind of like help your
Yeah.
Does it help your real job?
It helps your real job because you get to understand the programs. You understand where they're coming from, whether it be FEMA or the NFIP or private, the logic behind what they're writing and understand their policies more. So certainly when we start, diving into the analytics of exclusions on a policy or how to rate something, we understand it. We understand how to do it. So it's definitely plays
local industry expert.
Yep. So we get into that. Yeah, for sure.
So I got to know you through the chamber, and I got to know your wife through the chamber. She works at the South Shore. Talk about some of the stuff you've done with the Marshfield Chamber over the past few years.
Yeah, so we came
done
on
a lot.
Yeah, I think we've tried to, so the some of the stuff with the chamber, I think we started to look at, what are some of the bigger initiatives that the chamber can handle and do for this town, help out these small businesses and what are the businesses' needs? I think the chamber's always done a great job at holding events and doing networking things, and that's definitely an area of there. But there has to be a longer term vision with, making sure the businesses are viable in town and making sure that they continue to grow. At the same time, there's always a concern of overdevelopment from the town, and you don't want to become a city either. I think there's certainly that aspect to it. So, obviously we looked at, how do we help out, make this a place where people want to live, work, and play for that matter. And
my
keep
favorite phrase.
It is, yeah, and it's true. This town's got so many different places to go and do. So, we focused on the center first of Marshfield Center, Webster Square, and we've got an initiative that I think Lara probably talked about in the prior podcast.
The walkability.
Yeah, the walkability piece of it, because that's an area where it's got so much potential to be something greater. Not that it's not great now, but it's just, when you start tying in, the rail trails and biking and people, the playground areas, and now they got a candy store in there, and you got Rexicana and Levitate holding concerts. Yeah. It's just a bigger area in there, and the more people going there, we have to make it, a place that people want to stay, but also that they can walk safely and cross, the streets and, not get hit by cars.
Right. Yeah. I mean, because there's other communities that have this kind of model in place.
Yeah, and you're seeing a lot more communities go to these mixed use developments where they have retail shops in the bottom with stores above them. And Marshfield didn't do that at the time because it probably wasn't in the trend at the time. But that's something that could possibly be down the road if you ever looked at. There's some areas that would be perfect for that type of project. And
connecting everything together. It was always my frustration when I was the chamber president, when you talk about economic development with people, and they'd be like, "Oh, you're going to turn us into a city or something like that."
Yeah,
it's like, no,
that's
Route
1
not.
Saugus.
Yeah, Route 1.
We're
not. Like, because I remember having a conversation with the previous town planner, and it's like, what about like downtown? You have like downtown Scituate, Rockport, places like that, where you can kind of take that model.
Yeah, and that gets into the initiative I think every town's facing, whether it be the water or the transportation issues, and how do we get these, how do we develop this without, keeping our tax base and doing that. And that's some of the challenges Marshfield's going to have, is certainly on, being a coastal community and attracting businesses and keeping them in town. They're going to have to find that revenue source, and you can't ignore the commercial industry.
Right.
It's a balance, though. You definitely right.
You want to kind of keep the quaintness of the town, the character, but also you want to make sure that it's modern.
Right.
Yeah. So when you go to a chamber event, I'm just saying this from my perspective. You could throw a water bottle and hit 3 insurance guys at least.
Sure.
Probably.
Sure.
So what separates Flaherty from everyone else? What's that one big selling point? That's that big selling point you have.
Yeah, I think it's about having your relationship with the client. And other insurance agencies they all do a good job, and I'm not going to knock anybody else out there, but I don't want to take a policy or sell somebody a policy without them understanding it. I don't want someone coming back to call up and have Jonathan Grabowski call me up and say, why didn't you tell me this? Why wasn't my tools covered? Or, why was, I would have paid the $20 to have that coverage. So at least I try and point out and explain the coverages so people understand it. And insurance is not, it's a click of a button and going online and getting your policy. Yeah. It can be, but you're going to have a problem down the road when you go to file a claim. There's just no one's two situations are alike. So I chuckle when we go on forums and people's like, use these guys. Well, what do you have? Do you have a dog? Do you have losses? How far are you from the coast? Mm-hmm. Do you run a business out of your home? These all things factor into what carrier might be the best fit for you. Mm-hmm. And not every carrier is right for another one. So we try and use as many carriers as we can and find the right fit for that client. And it's never going to be the same carrier for every person.
Business is all about like referrals. What's the best referral for you? Yeah.
Usually my referrals come from other customers. They get to talk, they get excited of, what I've done for them or, the mm-hmm. experience they've had. So a lot of my referrals will come from there. Certainly there are other ones that come from your industry experts, whether, I'm referring something out to a mortgage lender. Are there other businesses
that are good referrals? Like, there are certain type of business people.
Yeah, I have a lot of, a lot of realtors will mm-hmm. call me up because they're running into situations, especially with flood, trying to find a solution for, either the seller or the buyer mm-hmm. of that home. And that's something we do quite often where we have a niche and, understanding for, that client or, the potential buyer or seller, how can we fix that for them, and we're able to provide that solution. So that would be the big differentiator between the other insurance agencies.
Wrapping up shortly here, but I wanted to ask you two kind of fun questions here.
Sure.
What's the best piece of advice you've been given from a business standpoint? Or something someone taught you that you're like, that you really kind of really stayed with you and it's important to what you do?
I think for me, it was always own up to your mistake, mm-hmm. I used to see a lot of people that would try in the background to fix something and not tell something about the scenario in there. And that in our industry, that's huge, So whether it be with a client or an underwriter or somebody like that, we try not to make them, but if we do, we're going to let them know, and it's more about, that piece and probably documenting everything that we've done. Mm-hmm. And that's not just for the risk for the client, but also for the company. You'd be surprised at how many times if you don't write something down and say, hey, I spoke to Mary at 10 a.m. on the underwriter and she approved this. Yeah. If I don't write that down and it comes back 3 years later and they deny the claim, that customer's going to have a problem. So
for sure.
Those are probably the two best pieces. Sorry.
So on a similar note, if you could jump back in the time machine and tell yourself when you first got started in the business something, what would you tell yourself?
I think when I first got in the business, I'd say trust people. Okay. And I don't mean that from the standpoint of trust everybody. I'd say it's exactly the opposite. Do your own research. Certainly take the answer that you got, but make sure you're doing your own research too, because there's the answer you get may be completely different than from that standpoint. So,
well, thank you very much for joining us here today, Thanks. Tim. I appreciate you coming on. Let's Talk Business.
Thank you. Appreciate it.